So earlier this week, I looked at theming in an Angular 6 application using the host context bindings in our component CSS or less files in my case. And what I wanted to do today was revisit this concept except using CSS Custom Properties instead of host context. Host context worked really well and I think created a very straightforward, very flexible, and also very backwards compatible solution, but it had a lot of verbosity, and the size of your CSS files would have to increase with the number of themes you had, and every time you added or removed a theme, you'd have to go through and change all of your Angular components. And CSS Custom Properties kind of fixes all of those problems. So just to refresh the memory, so I have this demo app here, and you can see I have this theme selector on the bottom, and I'm on the light theme now. I can go to dark theme, and you can see that everything here changes back and forth quite nicely. And this is now using CSS Custom Properties. So let's go ahead and take a look at what works here. So here is my app component, and actually none of the HTML in this demo have actually changed since the last version with the host context binding. So we're still using a CSS class on the app component to drive the theming, right? So we have a light theme and a dark theme. But the difference is, instead of having to bake this CSS class concept into all of the components, all we need to do is bake that into the app component, and the rest of the descending components can use CSS custom properties. So let's take a look at the less file behind the app component first, so we can sort of see the setup for the entire application. So here is my app.component.less file, and you'll see here that I do have conditional styles for the host with the light theme and the host with the dark theme, whereas in the previous demo these would set up less variables, less CSS variables. In this case, we're using them to set up CSS custom properties. Now, the nice thing about this is that we don't have to differentiate between themes at the variable level, meaning if you recall from our less variable approach, we actually had to have different light and dark variables. So instead of having something like color, I would have light color, and instead of having background color, I'd have to have light background color. And instead of canvas color, I'd have to have light canvas color. And then in the dark theme blocks, I'd have to have the quote-unquote dark version of all of those, dark color, dark background color, dark canvas color, and so on and so forth. But what you can see here is that the theme variables are actually all the same name. What actually changes is the value of the CSS custom property, not the name of the CSS custom property. And what this means is that the rest of the application doesn't care about what theme you're in. It doesn't care about how many themes there are. It doesn't even care if there are more than one theme. It only has to know that there are variables exist and that those variables drive the phenotype or the rendering of the component itself. So for example, if we jump into our one of our nested components, the canvas component, you can see here for the border, for example, I'm just consuming the canvas border color, right? There's no concept of light theme, there's no concept of dark theme, there's just a concept of canvas border color. Here I'm doing the same thing with canvas background color and canvas color. So what you can see is that, one, we don't have to include the variables file for our less variables anymore, because the CSS custom properties can leverage the natural inheritance of the DOM tree. So these just need to be defined somewhere higher up in the DOM, and they're being defined in our app component. And we get this out of the box. There's no host context blockers anymore. There's nothing conditional here. There's just the variable. So this removes a lot of the verbosity and the explicitness that we needed when we were using the host context. The host context was a really nice and really simple solution. This is a more elegant, more streamlined, more decoupled solution, right? We're really keeping the components more decoupled from the concept of theming. Yes, they're coupled to the concept of variables, but they're very decoupled to the way in which those variables become defined and how theming works in the application as a whole. Now let's jump back into our app component less file where we have all these values defined. And what you can see, sorry, gather my thoughts here for a second. What you can see in the light theme block is that I have these two comments, begin i.e. fallback and end i.e. fallback. And I have these here because while CSS custom properties have really good support in modern browsers, there is no support and will never be support in IE, including IE 11. Now, that's totally fine if you don't have to support IE 11, but I thought it would be a more interesting exploration if we try to gracefully degrade to work in IE, because that has some interesting implications in how all of this gets wired together. Now, if we jump over into my Webpack configuration, what I'm using in Webpack for this demo is that in between my raw loader for the less file and my less loader, I'm now using this PostCSS Loader. And the PostCSS Loader allows us to apply PostCSS plugins to our Webpack compilation pipeline. And what this allows me to do is to provide, let's say, static variable values at compile time that can be used by browsers that don't yet support CSS custom properties, again, like IE 11. And what this is going to do is it's going to hard code non-dynamic values into our CSS file. So if we jump back into our browser here and we actually look at the styles that get embedded in the head tag, right here are all of our variable values, and if we scroll down to say some consumption of it, so here you can see I have background color, dash dash background color, color dash dash color. You can see right before either of these usages we have hard-coded values, background color FFFF, color 33333. So these values here that are, oops, sorry about that. These values here that are preceding the CSS custom properties are the hard-coded values that can be used in IE 11. So one of the magical things about CSS and CSS parsers is that they essentially skip over anything that they don't recognize. So in modern browsers, it'll parse this background color white, it uses that, but then it can also parse the var consumption of the CSS custom property, so it'll end up using that. So essentially this overrides the one before. In IE 11, because it understands this first declaration, but it does not understand the second declaration, IE 11 will use the first declaration. So essentially what we can use is the hard-coded values to gracefully degrade in IE 11 where we don't have CSS custom properties support. Now, how do we tell Webpack and PostCSS to use particular values? And that's a really interesting problem because the value of a CSS custom property actually depends on the DOM tree at runtime, but our PostCSS is running at compile time, which means that it's quite limited in how it can evaluate CSS custom properties. And the PostCSS Custom Properties plugin can look in one of two places. It can look either in a root block, colon root selector, which we don't have in our Angular application because in Angular, right, all of our less files are being slurped into a particular component. So there is no concept of root. Your Angular application lives outside, well, I should say it lives below root in the HTML DOM tree. So the idea of having a root selector in an Angular component is like a little bit nonsensical. So instead, what I'm going to be using is providing explicit variable values to the PostCSS plugin at compile time. So if we jump back into the Webpack config, and we look here at our loader definition, you can see here's the PostCSS preset env. Of the features that it provides, I'm going to provide some additional options for the custom properties, right? We're talking about CSS custom properties. And here I'm going to say, when you're trying to inject those fallback values, use this collection of variables. Don't try to parse anything out of root. Root doesn't exist inside my Angular application. Use these IE fallback variables. Now, where do these IE fallback variables come from? And this is where I think it gets kind of interesting. These come from my app components less file, and I'm parsing them out at compile time. So if we jump up to the top of my Webpack configuration, you can see I'm defining these IE fallback variables from the result of this self-executing function or immediately invoked function expression. And what this does is it looks for my app component less file, pulls out the string, looks for the begin IE fallback and end IE fallback tokens, right? When if we jump back into our less file, we can see that we have the light theme here, and inside of the light theme we have this begin IE fallback and end IE fallback. So essentially what that function is doing is it's looking for this substring within this less file, okay? Then it's going to look for dash dash key value patterns within that extracted block, and for each one of those match patterns it's going to add a key value pair to this properties, and this property is what then becomes the IE fallback variables, and the IE fallback variables is what we point to our variable value. So essentially what this allows us to do is let our app component remain the source of truth for CSS custom properties, even in cases where the browser doesn't support CSS custom properties, and it doesn't require us to maintain two different sets, or remember to have to, well, we updated it here, now we have to go and update it in our Webpack. We just update it here, and that automatically gets pulled in because of these CSS comments into our Webpack configuration, passed into our PostCSS preset env plugin, and then extracted as values for our fallback variables. And the kind of cool thing about this is that we can actually move these things around to change which of the themes gets applied to IE11, right? So we're seeing here that here's IE11 defaulting to the light theme. But if we go back here, and let's go ahead and move this down to the dark theme, right? And then we'll go into our command line here, and let's do npm run build just to recompile our Webpack, and that'll take a second. Okay, so that has now finished. I'll just show you that that's done. Now if we go back into IE and we refresh, you'll say boom, now we have our dark theme as our default. Now one more thing to notice in IE is that we don't have the ability to switch themes. And that's because we're actually hiding the theme switching by default and only progressively enhancing the application to show theme switching if it's supported. And if we jump over into our browser and we look at our app components less file, which we're already in, and we go down to our footer, and the footer is where we show the theme switching. What you can see is that by default we're actually displaying none, and then we're using supports foo bar, and this is basically saying, hey, does the browser CSS parser have the ability to parse and understand this feature, which is the assignment of the CSS custom property? If it does, let's go ahead and show the footer, which is where we have our theme switching. So in essence, we're kind of using both graceful degradation for the CSS custom properties by parsing and providing these in our compile time plugin configuration, but we're also using progressive enhancement to only show this theme switching functionality in modern browsers that actually understand the CSS custom properties and will be able to consume and make use of switching from the light theme to the dark theme and back and forth and so on. So I don't know, this to me is very cool. This is only the second time that I've looked at theming, and it's the first time I've looked at PostCSS. So my mental model for it is not very strong, which is why I'm not really saying anything detailed about it. But hopefully this is enough to pique your curiosity and get you to look into this a bit more. I think CSS custom properties are a super elegant, super clean way to implement theming. And what's nice is that CSS custom properties are intended to be able to leak down even through things like native shadow DOM, right? That's one of the ways that a shadow DOM implemented component can actually provide styling hooks and theming hooks. So we're actually using it very much in the way that it was intended to. So anyway, I think it's very fascinating, and hopefully this has gotten you fascinated and interested in looking into it.